If, in the dead of night, you noticed your reflection in the mirror moving on its own, smiling when you weren't, tilting its head slowly toward you, would you dare to ask it what it wants? Or would you break the mirror, knowing you might unleash whatever lurks behind the glass? We called her Space Girl. Her real name was Megan Daniels, but no one called her that after the 2nd grade. She had been Space Girl for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of kid who always stood out in a crowd with her long red hair, pale skin, and big glasses. From the beginning, Space Girl didn't really fit in. She was quiet and distant, preferring to be on her own. While we played and talked, she would sit by herself with her little notebook, drawing or writing. She was always somewhere else, in her own world. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now, looking back, I realize why we picked on her. She was different, and different was enough to make her a target. I'm not saying it was right. Kids can be cruel for no reason, and we were. But at the time, we didn't understand the harm we were causing. It was Sasha Brown who started the real trouble. One day she told me that Space Girl was retarded because her mother was on drugs. Sasha probably made it up, but we all believed her without question. Sasha had always been mean to Space Girl, and that day she took it to the next level. It started when we were in 5th grade. It was a rainy day, so we had to stay inside for recess. Space Girl, like usual, sat alone at her desk, drawing in her notebook. Sasha, Tanya, and I were sitting nearby, watching her. Sasha had that mischievous glint in her eye, the one she always had when she was about to do something mean. "I can't believe they let that retard stay with us," Sasha whispered to me, loud enough for only us to hear. "What's the point of her being here? She's not going to learn anything." "Better than leaving her at home with her crackhead mum," Tanya chimed in. "My dad says he sees a different car at her house every day. He says guys pay her mum for sex." We were too embarrassed to actually say the word sex out loud at that age. It was still a mystery to us, something that we thought was dirty and wrong. Space Girl must have heard us because she paused, her eyes glancing in our direction for just a second. But instead of saying anything, she looked back down at her notebook and kept drawing. Sasha wasn't satisfied with that. She wanted a reaction. "What, you got a problem, Space Girl?" Sasha sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Space Girl didn't answer. She just kept her head down, trying to ignore us. But Sasha wasn't about to let her off the hook. She got up, walked over to Space Girl's desk, and grabbed the notebook from her hands before Space Girl could stop her. "What's this? A unicorn?" Sasha laughed as she flipped through the pages. "What are you, 5? She handed the notebook to me and I looked at it. It was actually a really nice drawing of a unicorn, colorful and detailed. But instead of saying anything kind, I passed it to Tanya. Space Girl just sat there, watching helplessly. "You can't even draw," Tanya said, tearing the page out of the notebook. Space Girl let out a small sound, like she'd been hit. Tanya crumpled up the drawing and threw it on the floor beside her desk. "Maybe next time you can draw something that isn't trash," Tanya sneered. Sasha giggled, enjoying the cruelty. I felt a pang of guilt as Space Girl bent down to pick up her notebook, avoiding eye contact with any of us. I could see the hurt in her face, but I didn't say or do anything to stop it. I just followed Sasha and Tanya, leaving her there. That day marked the beginning of Space Girl being the easy target for Sasha and Tanya, and to my shame, I often joined them. Every time Space Girl sat under her usual tree during recess, working on her drawings, we would walk by and make fun of her. "Wow, that's amazing," Sasha would say in a fake sweet voice. "Did you mean to make it look like it got run over by a car?" Space Girl never responded. She just kept drawing, her head down, trying to disappear. I didn't stop them, and I even laughed along with them sometimes. Things escalated in 7th grade. There were rumors going around that James Hardy, a tough kid from another class, was angry with Space Girl. Apparently, someone had seen his dad at Space Girl's house, and rumors spread that his dad was having an affair with her mom. The story got twisted until people were saying that James and Space Girl were secretly dating. It was ridiculous, but it didn't stop the gossip. One day during recess, Brian Jordan and his brother Mike decided to pull a prank on James. They grabbed Space Girl, hid her behind a door, and waited for James to walk through. When he did, they shoved her into him, and someone snapped a picture. Space Girl fell into James, knocking him over. The boys laughed, teasing James, saying that Space Girl wanted to kiss him. Space Girl scrambled to pick up her notebook, but someone kicked it out of reach. She looked terrified, her eyes wide as she tried to get away from James. But James was furious. He punched her hard in the face, and she fell to the ground. Then he went after Brian, hitting him too. The teacher broke up the fight, but by then the damage was done. Space Girl, James, and the Jordan brothers were all suspended. That was the last we saw of James and the Jordan brothers. A few days later, on Christmas Eve, there was a car accident. Brian and Mike, along with their parents, were killed. And just a few days after that, James died too, supposedly attacked by an animal while shoveling snow. It was all over the news, and everyone in town was talking about it. But it didn't make sense to me. I'd never heard of anything like that happening before. After Christmas break, I went to Sasha's house. We were going to the mall together with some gift cards we'd gotten for Christmas. When I got there, she seemed excited, telling me she had something funny to show me. When we went up to her room, I saw Space Girl's notebook sitting on her desk. My stomach dropped. "Where did you get this?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Space Girl dropped it during the prank," Sasha said casually. "I thought I'd keep it just for fun." She opened the notebook and showed me her latest drawings, crude pictures of Space Girl killing herself in various ways. Hanging from a rope, putting a gun in her mouth, standing on the edge of a building. Page after page of these horrible images. "What do you think?" Sasha asked, grinning. "She's going to lose it when she sees this." I was horrified. "Sasha, this is really messed up," I said. "You can't just steal her notebook and draw this stuff." "It's Space Girl," Sasha said, rolling her eyes. "Who cares?" I did something I'd never done before. I stood up to Sasha. "No, this is wrong," I said. I grabbed the notebook and started tearing out the pages of Space Girl's suicide drawings. Sasha tried to stop me, but I pushed her away. I didn't mean to push so hard, but she fell, looking up at me in shock. I'd never pushed her before. I ran out of her house, clutching Space Girl's notebook, and didn't stop until I was home. My heart was racing, and I felt a mix of fear and guilt. I didn't know what Sasha would do after this, but I knew I had done the right thing. Over the next few days, I waited anxiously, half expecting Sasha to get me in trouble. But nothing happened. It seemed like Sasha didn't tell anyone about the notebook or the fight. Maybe she knew that what she did was too wrong to admit. When school started again in January, I went straight to Space Girl. She was sitting at her desk, drawing in a new notebook. I approached her cautiously, not sure how she would react. "I'm sorry," I said, handing her the old notebook. "Sasha took it. I got it back for you. I had to take out some pages. She drew some really awful things, but it's yours again." Space Girl stared at me for a long moment before quietly saying, "Thanks." That was it, just one word, but it felt like a small step forward. From that day on, things were different. I didn't hang out with Sasha or Tanya anymore, and they didn't talk to me either. I had burned those bridges, but it was worth it. I'd finally done something right, even if it was too late. The bullying didn't stop, though. Sasha and Tanya still picked on Space Girl, and I still felt guilty for all the times I had joined in. But I tried to stand up for her whenever I could. By the time we reached high school, everything had changed. Sasha and I weren't friends anymore, and I had moved on to a new group of people. Space Girl was still the same, quiet and distant, always drawing in her notebook. But I didn't make fun of her anymore. In fact, I admired her. She had a gift that none of us could understand. In 10th grade, we both ended up in the same art class. I partnered with Space Girl for a project where we had to draw each other. She seemed surprised that I chose her as my partner, but she agreed. We were supposed to take turns drawing portraits of each other, and I went to her house one afternoon to work on the project. I was nervous going to Space Girl's house, mainly because of all the rumors that had swirled around her mum for years. But when I got there, the house was nothing like I expected. It was clean and tidy, and her mum, who looked a lot like an older version of Space Girl, was polite, though not overly friendly. "You must be Jane," her mum said when she opened the door. "Megan's upstairs. She's been waiting for you." I followed her directions and found myself in Space Girl's room. The walls were covered in paintings. Beautiful, intricate scenes of fantasy worlds with unicorns, castles, and magical forests. It was like stepping into a different universe. I couldn't believe how talented she was. "Wow," I said, staring at the paintings. "Did you do all of these?" "Yeah," she said softly, setting up her easel. "It helps me relax." I could tell that drawing and painting were more than just hobbies for her. They were her escape. Her artwork was her way of dealing with everything that had happened over the years. We started working on the portraits. She drew me first, and I sat quietly as she sketched. Her concentration was intense, and she barely spoke as her pencil moved across the page. When she finished, she showed me the portrait, and I was blown away. It didn't look like a normal portrait. It was me, but there was something magical about it. She had added small details that made it look almost otherworldly, like I was part of one of her fantasy worlds. There were flowers in my hair, and a soft glow surrounded me. I couldn't believe how beautiful it was. "This is incredible," I said, my voice full of admiration. "You're really talented, Megan." She smiled shyly. "Thanks." For the first time, I saw her as more than just the quiet girl everyone picked on. She was an artist, and she was brilliant at what she did. The next day at school, we turned in our portraits. My drawing of Space Girl was plain and nothing compared to hers, but our teacher loved her work. She praised Space Girl for her talent, and for the first time, I saw Space Girl smile in class. But of course, Sasha couldn't leave it alone. During lunch, Sasha and Tanya found me in the cafeteria. They had seen the portrait Space Girl drew of me, and Sasha wasn't happy about it. "Where's your crown of flowers, dyke?" Sasha sneered, blocking my way as I tried to walk past them. "Leave me alone," I muttered, trying to avoid her. But Sasha wasn't about to stop. "I always knew you were into that freak Space Girl. Now you're her model. What did you do? Go to her house and kiss her or something? You must have..." "'Cause she drew that for you," Sasha taunted. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my cool, but Sasha wasn't done. "Maybe she only likes retarded girls like her," Tanya added, laughing. I stopped in my tracks. I felt my face grow hot with anger. I turned around, and before I knew it, I swung my lunch tray at Sasha, hitting her hard across the face. She fell to the ground, stunned, and Tanya lunged at me, pushing me back against the wall. We were both pulled apart by other students, and soon teachers rushed in. The principal suspended me for 3 days. Sasha and Tanya got off without any punishment, of course. They claimed I had attacked them out of nowhere, and it was their word against mine. I was furious, but there was nothing I could do. When I came back to school, I found out that something even worse had happened. The portrait Space Girl had painted of me had been vandalized. Someone had written "retard fucking dyke" across it in red paint. It was displayed in the hallway outside the art room, and when I saw it, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. The painting was taken down immediately, but the damage was done. Sasha had gotten her revenge. I didn't see Space Girl for the rest of the day, but when I finally found her in the library, she looked different. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red like she'd been crying. "I'm sorry about the painting," I said quietly as I sat down across from her. "I don't know who did it, but I'm so sorry." Space Girl didn't look up. She just stared down at her notebook, sketching quietly. "It's not about the painting," she finally said, her voice soft. "I'm used to people doing stuff like that." "What do you mean?" I asked. She sighed and pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. She slid it across the table to me, and I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a drawing of Space Girl hanging from a noose, and next to her was me, smiling. The words "retard dyke wedding" were scrawled across the top. "I found this in my locker," she said, her voice trembling. "There were more, a lot more." My stomach churned. This was the same kind of thing Sasha had drawn in Space Girl's notebook before. I felt sick, and all the guilt I had pushed aside for years came flooding back. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, but Space Girl didn't say anything. I tried to talk to the principal about it, to tell him that Sasha was behind all of this, but nothing came of it. Without proof, they couldn't do anything. Sasha continued to torment Space Girl, and I felt powerless to stop it. A few days later, something strange happened. I was walking home when Tanya followed me. She caught up with me in a secluded area, away from the school, and I could tell something was wrong. She had a mean look on her face, the kind she always had when she was about to start trouble. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaky. Tanya grinned. "Sasha and I have a little surprise for you." I didn't like the sound of that. My heart raced as I realized I was alone with her, and there was no one around to help me. Tanya grabbed my arm and started dragging me down the path toward the park. I struggled, but she was stronger than me. When we got to the park, Sasha was there, sitting on a bench with a red gas can beside her. My blood ran cold when I saw what she was holding, the portrait Space Girl had painted of me. "Hey, Jane," Sasha said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How's it going?" "What is this?" I asked, trying to sound brave, but my voice was shaking. Sasha stood up and poured the gasoline over the painting. "I'm just here to say goodbye to your little dike project," she said, pulling out a book of matches. I froze, watching in horror as she prepared to light the painting on fire. But then something unbelievable happened. Behind us, I heard a strange noise, like the sound of hooves on the pavement. I turned around and my jaw dropped. Standing there, in the middle of the park, was a unicorn. But it wasn't just any unicorn. It looked like one of Space Girl's drawings come to life. Its body was pale and almost two-dimensional, with thin blue lines running across it like something out of a notebook. It looked like it had stepped right off a page. Tanya let go of me and stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. The unicorn let out a loud snort, and before any of us could react, it charged straight at Tanya. Its horn pierced through her chest, lifting her off the ground as she let out a blood-curdling scream. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place as I watched the unicorn trample her body over and over, until she was nothing but a lifeless heap on the ground. Sasha screamed and tried to run, but something else caught her. The painting, the portrait of me, had changed. My painted self reached out of the canvas, grabbing Sasha's leg and pulling her down toward the painting. Sasha struggled, but the more she fought, the more the painting pulled her in. She looked at me, terror in her eyes. "Jane, help me, please!" she screamed. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching as the painted version of me dragged Sasha into the canvas, her screams fading until she was completely gone. The painting was the only thing left, now showing Sasha, her face twisted in horror. The unicorn let out another snort before turning and disappearing into the woods. I was left standing there, alone with the painting. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it, but eventually I picked it up. I took it home with me, not sure what else to do. I never told anyone what happened. Tanya's death was ruled an animal attack, and no one ever found Sasha. I didn't need to ask Space Girl what happened. I think on some level I already knew. Years passed and I tried to move on, but I never forgot Space Girl. I saw her name again years later in an art magazine. She had become a successful painter, known for her haunting and magical works. I went to one of her exhibits, where I saw her again after all those years. We didn't say much, but we didn't need to. We both knew how much had changed and how much we had gone through. The gallery was filled with her paintings, each one more mesmerizing than the last. Fantasy worlds full of vibrant colors, mythical creatures, and landscapes that seemed to come to life. It was everything I remembered from her childhood, only now even more powerful and fully realized. As I wandered through the exhibit, I found myself drawn to one painting in particular. It was the portrait she had done of me back in high school, but like everything else, it had changed. The flowers were still there, and the peaceful expression remained. But there was a deeper sadness in my eyes, as if the years of guilt and regret had somehow been captured in the painting. It was beautiful, but it also reminded me of everything we had been through. I stood in front of the painting for what felt like hours, lost in thought, until I felt someone standing beside me. I turned, and there she was, Megan, Space Girl. She hadn't changed much since high school, though she looked more confident, more composed. Her red hair was tied back, and she wore simple clothes, nothing flashy, but there was an undeniable presence about her. "It's been a long time," she said, her voice calm and soft, just like I remembered. Yeah, I replied, not knowing what else to say. Your work is amazing. I'm not surprised you made it as an artist. Thanks, she said, her eyes drifting to the painting of me. I didn't think you'd come. I wasn't sure if I should, I admitted, but when I saw your name, I just had to. We stood there in silence for a moment, both of us staring at the painting. There were so many things I wanted to say, so many apologies that still felt stuck in my throat, but somehow I knew words wouldn't be enough. I'm sorry, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. For everything. For the way we treated you. For not standing up to Sasha sooner. I know it's too late, but I'm really sorry. Megan didn't say anything at first. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. I know, she said quietly, but we can't change the past. I've moved on. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that I understood. She had moved on, perhaps long before I had. She had found her way out of that dark place, through her art, through her imagination. But the scars were still there, in both of us. I'm glad you're doing well, I said, meaning every word. I always knew you were talented, but this is something else. Thank you, she said again, her voice softer this time. I've learned to turn all that pain into something beautiful. It's the only way I could deal with it. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Art had been her escape, her way of coping with everything, and now it had become her strength. As we stood there, I thought about everything that had happened since we were kids. The bullying, the rumors, the terrible things Sasha and Tanya had done, and the guilt I carried for not standing up sooner. I thought about the unicorn, the painting, and the way Sasha had disappeared that day. I still didn't understand it completely, but I knew that some things weren't meant to be understood. I hope you found peace, I said softly, feeling like it was the last thing I needed to say. Megan looked at me, her gaze steady. I have, she replied, and I hope you do too. With that, she gave me a small, almost sad smile and walked away, leaving me standing in front of the painting. I watched her go, realizing that this was the last chapter of our story. We had both moved on, in our own ways, and while the past would never disappear, it no longer had the power to define us. As I left the gallery, I felt lighter than I had in years. The guilt I had carried with me for so long had started to lift. I wasn't sure if I deserved forgiveness, but I had done what I could to make things right, even if it was too late. And in that, I found some peace. Megan, Space Girl, had always been different. But in the end, it was her difference that made her strong, that allowed her to turn the pain we caused her into something beautiful. She had found her place in the world, a place where unicorns roamed free and where the cruelty of the past could be left behind. As for me, I learned something important. It's never too late to change, to try and make amends, even if you can't erase the harm you've done. We all live with our choices, but we can choose to do better. We can choose to grow. Years later, I still think about Space Girl from time to time. I think about her art, her strength, and the way she found peace in the worlds she created. And I hope, wherever she is, she's happy, painting her magical landscapes, free from the shadows of the past. And as for me, I'll always carry the memory of her with me, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always a way out, always a way to find beauty in the things that once caused us pain. The painting of Sasha still hangs in my studio at home, a silent reminder of the past. But now, when I look at it, I no longer feel guilt or regret. Instead, I feel a sense of closure. I did what I could, and Megan, Space Girl, found her peace. That's all that matters. In the end, we all have our stories, and this was ours. We lived it, we learned from it, and now we can finally let it go. I've worked as a security guard for most of my life. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills. I've worked in gas stations, convenience stores, and small shops, places where you mostly just sit around, keeping an eye on things, waiting for something to happen, which it usually doesn't. But when I saw the ad for a night shift at the local mall, I thought I'd finally stumbled on something better. The pay was good, better than anything I'd seen in years. The hours weren't bad either, 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., just one building to watch, and I figured it would be quiet, maybe even easy. I could already picture myself sitting back in the security office, watching the cameras, and strolling around the deserted mall in the middle of the night. It seemed like the perfect job. How hard could it be? I applied immediately, and to my surprise, I got a call the very next day. It was the manager, Mr. Hensley, asking if I could come in for an interview that afternoon. It seemed a little sudden, but I didn't question it. I needed the job, and the mall wasn't far from where I lived. I drove over, though I had a strange feeling that everything was moving too fast. Was the mall really that desperate to fill this position? The interview was short, almost rushed. Mr. Hensley didn't ask much about my experience and seemed distracted as he went over the basics. Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, do hourly patrols, make sure the entrances are locked, the usual stuff. But near the end of the interview, he asked, "Can you start tonight?" I wasn't expecting that. Most places take a while with paperwork or background checks, but I wasn't going to argue. "Sure," I said, trying not to sound too eager. He looked relieved, which struck me as odd. "Good. We're short on staff," he said, rubbing his temples like the day had already been too long. "The last few guards didn't last long. I hope you'll be different." That comment made me pause. What did he mean by that? But before I could ask, he handed me a key to the office and told me to report at 11 p.m. sharp. The sooner I started, the sooner I'd get paid. So I shook his hand, left the office, and went home to get a few hours of sleep before my shift. When I arrived at the mall that night, it was dark and empty. The parking lot, usually filled with cars, had only a few scattered under the dim glow of the parking lights. The whole place felt too big, too quiet, and for a second, I considered turning around and going home. Something felt off, but I brushed it off as first-day jitters. I walked up to the employee entrance where Mr. Hensley was waiting for me. He didn't say much, just led me through the winding corridors to the security office, explaining the procedures again as we walked. The office itself was a small, cramped room filled with screens that showed grainy footage from the cameras spread throughout the mall. "Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, he repeated. "Do your rounds. Make sure nothing's out of place. And keep an eye on the escalators and the play area. Things happen there sometimes." That last part made me stop. "Things happen?" I asked, confused. He waved his hand, dismissing it. "Kids, mostly. Sneaking in, trying to mess around after hours. You'll see." I nodded, though the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. He handed me a printed list of instructions, shook my hand, and said, "Good luck. I'll see you in the morning." Once he left, I was alone. The silence in the empty mall was almost deafening. I sat down in front of the monitors, flipping through the camera feeds. The escalators were still, the stores were dark, and for a moment, I relaxed. It was just a mall, after all. Nothing creepy about it. Just a big, empty building. 20 minutes into my shift, I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly, my heart racing. A janitor stood there, grinning at my reaction. "Didn't mean to scare you, buddy," he said, his voice light, friendly. "You must be the new guy." I let out a nervous laugh, shaking off the tension. "Yeah, that's me. I didn't know there was a janitor here at night." He shrugged. "They always keep one of us around to clean up, make sure everything's ready for the next day." His tone grew more serious. "Just make sure you follow the rules." I blinked. "The rules? You mean the instructions the manager gave me?" He handed me a crumpled piece of paper, his face suddenly serious. "These aren't from the manager. These are the real rules you'll need to make it through the night." I unfolded the paper, expecting a joke, but the list of rules on it was anything but funny. Rules to keep you safe at night. Rule 1. Check the security cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, but don't stare at the footage for too long. Rule 2. Never look directly at the mannequins after midnight. If they move, leave the area immediately. I stared at the paper, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "You're serious?" The janitor's grin had vanished. "I'm warning you. Follow the rules, or you'll end up like the last guy." I tried to laugh it off, but my voice came out shaky. "You mean the last guard?" He nodded. "Quit after one night." "Right." I stuffed the paper in my pocket, chuckling nervously. "Well, I'm going to make my first round." The janitor stepped aside, giving me a long look. "Take care," he said, his voice somber. I nodded and walked out of the office, but his words stuck with me. There was something about his tone that unsettled me, made me feel like I was walking into something I wasn't prepared for. But I wasn't going to let some creepy list of rules mess with my head. It was just after midnight when I started my patrol. The mall was even creepier at night than I had imagined. The dim lighting cast long, twisting shadows along the tiled floors, and every sound seemed amplified. My footsteps echoing off the walls, the hum of the overhead lights, and the occasional creak of the building settling. As I made my way down one of the main hallways, I noticed something strange. The door to one of the clothing stores was wide open. I stopped, shining my flashlight into the darkened interior. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but as I swept the light across the room, I thought I saw movement, a shadow just out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, but there was nothing, just a few mannequins standing near the back. I sighed, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, the faint sound of fabric rustling. My flashlight flicked back to the mannequins, and that's when I noticed one of them had definitely moved. It was standing closer than before, slightly out of position. My heart started to race. "Hey, janitor!" I called out, trying to sound frustrated. This had to be some kind of prank. He was probably watching me from somewhere, trying to scare the new guy. But there was no answer, just the eerie rustling of fabric behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and there it was. The mannequin, now standing in the middle of the hallway, staring at me with its blank, lifeless face. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. It was just a mannequin. Mannequins don't move. But it was moving. Its head slowly turned toward me, and I heard the faint scraping sound of its feet dragging across the floor. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I turned and sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing wildly through the empty mall. I didn't stop running until I rounded a corner and ducked into the restroom, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm down. It had to be a prank. There was no way the mannequin had moved, but when I looked up into the mirror, I froze. There was someone standing behind me. A woman, dressed in a plain cleaning uniform, her back turned to me. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, but the restroom was empty. No one was there. I collapsed against the sink, my mind spinning. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the list of rules, my hands shaking as I unfolded the paper. I scanned the next few rules, my heart sinking as I read them. Rule 3. If a mannequin looks like it's following you, don't look back. Mannequins sometimes follow guards, but if you ignore them, they'll stop. If you look, they'll know you're aware and they'll get closer. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I had already broken that rule. My heart raced as I scanned the paper again, hoping there was some way to fix it. But the rules didn't give any second chances. I shoved the paper back into my pocket and looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and pale. I needed to get out of the restroom and back to the security office where I could see the cameras. It was safer there. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the restroom, trying to move quietly down the hallway. The mannequins wouldn't follow me if I didn't look, right? That's what the rule said. I forced myself not to glance over my shoulder, though every instinct screamed at me to check. Every sound, every creak felt like something moving behind me, but I pushed forward, keeping my eyes straight ahead. When I reached the security office, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, collapsing into the chair in front of the monitors. My chest was heaving, and I felt like I had just run a marathon, but at least I was safe now. I flipped through the camera feeds, hoping for some relief. The mall's hallways were still and empty. The mannequins hadn't moved. The escalators were silent. Everything looked fine. I let out a shaky breath, but my fingers trembled as I checked the next rule on the list. Rule 4. Avoid looking into the mirrors of the restroom. I had already broken that one too. My stomach twisted. I didn't know what that meant or what would happen next, but whatever it was, I was sure I didn't want to find out. I quickly moved on to the next rules, hoping to keep ahead of whatever was coming. Rule 5. If you hear someone talking inside an abandoned store, do not listen. I tensed up, ears straining in the silence. Nothing, no voices. Just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the low buzz of the security monitors. I sat back in the chair, wiping the sweat from my forehead. Suddenly, the monitors flickered. For a split second, the screen flashed with static, and then I heard it, a soft, muffled voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but I could hear it clearly. The sound seemed to be coming from one of the abandoned stores, the ones that had been shut down for years. My blood ran cold. I squeezed my eyes shut and covered my ears. Don't listen. Don't listen. I repeated it over and over in my head. The voice grew louder, more insistent. It was like someone was calling for me, but the words were jumbled, too low to make out. My hands pressed tighter against my ears, trying to drown it out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the voice faded. I uncovered my ears and cautiously opened my eyes. The mall was quiet again. The camera feeds returned to normal, showing empty hallways and still mannequins. I glanced at my watch. 2:30 a.m. Only 3.5 more hours to go. I had to survive until morning. The next rule came to mind, and I hurried to check it. Rule 6. If you hear a child laughing from the play area, leave immediately. I quickly flipped the camera feed to the play area. The brightly colored play structures looked eerie under the dim emergency lights, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. For now, everything seemed fine. No laughter, no children. But I wasn't taking any chances. I made a mental note to avoid the play area during my rounds. I couldn't risk getting too close if something were to happen. For a while, the mall stayed quiet, almost too quiet. The eerie stillness made my skin crawl. I stayed in the security office, my eyes glued to the monitors. Nothing moved. The mannequins hadn't shifted positions, the escalators remained frozen, and there was no strange voice whispering from the stores. But the tension in the air didn't fade. Then, around 3:00 a.m., the faint sound of giggling broke through the silence. My heart sank. It was coming from the play area. The sound was soft, almost playful, but it echoed unnaturally through the halls. My stomach twisted as the laughter grew louder, ringing in my ears. Leave immediately. I jumped up from my chair and bolted out of the security office, running in the opposite direction of the play area. I didn't want to see what was making that sound. I didn't care. I needed to get as far away from it as possible. I kept running until I found myself near the entrance to the mall, gasping for breath. The laughter had stopped, but the fear remained. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My heart pounded in my chest, and sweat dripped down my face. I couldn't take much more of this. I checked my watch, 4:00 a.m. My heart skipped a beat. Rule 8. Lock the security office door between 4:00 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. and do not open it for anyone. If they knock, they might not be the person you think they are. Check the cameras to confirm. I had to get back to the office, now. I sprinted down the hall, every sound amplified in the dark, empty space. My legs ached, but I pushed on, forcing myself to keep moving. The hallway stretched out in front of me, but the office wasn't far. I just had to reach it, lock the door, and wait until it was safe. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, just like the rules said. My chest heaved as I collapsed into the chair again, my eyes glued to the monitors. The hallways were empty, no movement, no sounds, but I knew I couldn't relax. The knock came at 4:05 a.m. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. I stared at the door, my hands trembling. Then I heard a voice, clear as day. "Hey, it's Mr. Hensley. Can you let me in? We need to talk." I froze. I quickly checked the camera feed outside the office. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the knocking continued, louder this time. "Come on, man, it's just me," the voice insisted. "Open up." I pressed my hands against my ears, shutting my eyes tight. I wasn't going to break the rule. I wasn't going to open the door. The knocking grew more frantic, like someone pounding on the door with their fists. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my hands over my ears, blocking out the sound. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I opened my eyes cautiously and checked the clock. 4:31 a.m. It was over. I slowly uncovered my ears, my body trembling from the adrenaline. The hallway outside the office was empty. I had followed the rule, and whatever had been knocking had given up. I leaned back in the chair, exhausted but relieved. But there were still 2 more rules to go. Rule 9. If you hear someone crying in a dressing room, do not open the door. I scanned the camera feeds, my fingers tapping nervously on the desk. Everything seemed fine for now, but the rules had been right so far, and I knew I couldn't let my guard down. I kept my eyes on the cameras, praying the night would pass without incident. Then, just after 5 a.m., I heard it, a faint humming sound, like the low buzz of machinery. I flipped to the escalator camera, and my heart sank. The escalator was running. Rule 10. If you hear an escalator running, do not investigate. Watch the area on the security cameras. I stayed glued to the monitor, watching as the escalator slowly moved, the steps grinding mechanically against each other. There was no one on it, but the sight of it moving on its own sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't going to leave the office. I wasn't going anywhere near that escalator. The escalator finally stopped on its own, the hum of the machinery fading back into silence. I checked my watch, 5:30 a.m., just half an hour to go. I stayed in the office for the rest of the night, watching the cameras, waiting for the morning to come. Every second felt like an eternity, but finally the clock struck 6 a.m. There was a knock at the door. This time, when I checked the camera, I saw Mr. Hensley standing outside. It really was him. I unlocked the door, my body still shaking from the events of the night. Mr. Hensley gave me a concerned look. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. I nodded, too tired to speak. He sighed. "It gets easier after the first night. You did well." I didn't reply. I handed him the key and left the mall without another word. Whatever was happening in that mall, I wasn't sticking around to find out more. I quit on the spot and never looked back. Some places just aren't worth the paycheck. And that mall, it was one of them. I'll never return. When I was 8 years old, my family moved from a noisy city to a quiet town in the countryside. My dad had gotten a job at a big nuclear power plant there, and we all had to move. The plant was huge, standing like a giant, with smoke coming out of its tall chimneys. The houses around it seemed small, as if someone built them in a rush, like they forgot that people working at the plant would need a place to live. We lived on Strand Street, near Building A of the plant. I still remember the day we moved. As we got closer to the plant, I felt the air get heavy, almost like a thick blanket was placed over me. When I took a breath, it tasted strange, like chemicals. I rolled up my window, trying to keep that weird taste out. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning orange. We had been packing all day, and were finally driving into town, but it was strange. No one was around. The streets were empty, and I couldn't see any lights in the houses. I pressed my face against the car window, trying to look inside the houses, but every window was covered with curtains or blinds. It felt like no one was home. My mum, who could always tell what I was thinking, turned around and smiled. "I'm sure there are lots of kids on our street, Charlie," she said, holding my hand. I tried to smile back, though I wasn't sure I believed her. "There's our house," my dad said excitedly, pointing to a small brick house at the end of the street. He parked the car on the narrow road, and as he did, I noticed a man and a woman walking by quickly, holding grey shopping bags. They kept looking behind them, like they were being followed. When they got to a house a few doors down from ours, the woman sighed with relief. She pointed at us and whispered something to the man. He glanced at my parents, who were busy unpacking the car, with a worried look on his face. I stepped out of the car and stood next to my dad as he shook the man's hand. My dad was the type of person who could talk to anyone, even if they didn't seem like they wanted to talk. The man's name was Mr. Grieg, and he looked nervous. He kept glancing around like he was expecting something bad to happen. His wife, Mrs. Grieg, stood nearby, twisting her hands. While they were talking, I heard a tap on the Grieg's window. I looked over and saw a boy about my age peeking through the thick curtains. He grinned at me, showing a missing front tooth. Then, just as quickly, he disappeared from the window, and a moment later, I heard footsteps rushing down the street. The boy ran right up to me and almost knocked me over. "I'm Toby," he said excitedly, barely giving me a chance to say my name. He immediately started talking about the book I was holding and asked if I had read the scary part yet. He talked so fast that I could hardly keep up. Toby's parents looked even more nervous now, and my mum gently told Toby and me to go inside and explore the house while the adults continued talking. As we walked inside, Toby kept chatting, his voice echoing around the empty rooms. I looked back to see the Griegs speaking quietly to my parents. My dad wasn't smiling anymore, and both my parents now had the same worried look I had seen on Toby's parents. The move was a big change for me. There were things I liked, like having my own room. Our old apartment in the city had been small, and now I had more space to play. I also liked knowing that I would start at my new school with Toby by my side in September. But some things were harder to get used to. Toby and I would play outside for hours, running around or kicking a ball. But every evening, when the sun began to set, our mums would call us inside. Toby's mum, Mrs. Grieg, was always quick to call him, as if she was waiting by the door for the exact moment the sun disappeared. Toby didn't seem to mind. He would roll his eyes, smile at me, and run back to his house. For me, it was strange. In the city, I could play outside until it got dark, and my mum wouldn't worry. But here, she seemed scared. She would watch me walk the short distance to our house, and only relax when I was inside. My dad would come home a little while later, walking with Mr. Grieg from the plant. He would lock the door behind him, and we'd close all the curtains before sitting down for dinner. The plant's humming was always in the background. Weeks passed, and I got used to our new routine. But one thing that still bothered me was the noise from the plant. Some days it was just a low hum, but on other days it made this awful screeching sound that shook the ground beneath us. I told Toby about it one day while we were playing. He held his hand up to his ear and said, "Oh yeah, I guess I don't hear it anymore. You get used to it after a while." "I don't know how you can get used to something that loud," I said. Toby thought for a moment and then, in a quiet voice, said, "Well, there is one place where you can't hear it at all." That caught my attention. "Really? Where?" I asked eagerly. "It's kind of far," Toby said, but he could already see that I was excited. I hadn't explored much beyond our street, and I was itching to see more. Toby checked his watch and looked up at the sky. "We still have time," he decided. "Let's go." We started running, with Toby leading the way. After a while, the paved road turned into a path, with grass growing through the cracks. The air felt fresher, and the heavy feeling I always had near the plant started to fade. I could breathe more easily. "There it is," Toby said proudly. We had reached a clearing surrounded by trees. The grass was soft and green, and colorful flowers were scattered around. A small stream flowed through the clearing, and a brick bridge stood over it. The place was so peaceful, like it was from another world. I couldn't believe how different it was from the grey streets back home. And just like Toby said, it was quiet. The noise from the plant was completely gone. All I could hear was the sound of the stream and the wind rustling through the trees. "It's nice here, isn't it?" Toby asked, smiling. "It's amazing," I said. I wanted to stay there forever. We spent the rest of the day playing, picking flowers, climbing trees, and throwing sticks into the stream to see whose would float the farthest. I felt free, like the worries of the town and the plant couldn't reach me here. But then I noticed the sun was starting to set. "We should go," I said, suddenly feeling anxious. Toby looked disappointed, but he nodded. "Yeah, our parents will be mad if we're late." Reluctantly, we left the clearing and headed back. But as we walked, the sky grew darker. The trees, which had looked so beautiful before, now seemed scary, their branches stretched out like long fingers, blocking the fading light. Then we heard it, a rustling sound behind us. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it grew louder, like something was following us. Toby squeezed my hand and whispered, "Let's run." We took off, running as fast as we could, but whatever was behind us started moving faster too. It was getting closer. I could hear its footsteps, heavy and fast. My heart was pounding and I was terrified. Suddenly, a horrible screech filled the air. It was so loud and awful that it made my ears ring. I felt my legs buckle beneath me, and I tripped, falling hard on the pavement. Something thick and black began to spread out around me. It looked like tar, but it was alive, moving like it was chasing me. I tried to get up, but my legs were stuck. "Toby!" I screamed, but Toby was already pulling me, trying to get me free. The black tar was burning my skin, and I could feel it creeping up my legs. Then I saw it, the creature. It was massive, crawling toward us, its body twisted in ways that didn't seem natural, and it made these horrible clicking noises as it moved. Just as the tar reached my knees, Toby gave one last pull, and I was free. We ran for our lives, not stopping until we reached the front door of my house. My parents slammed the door shut, bolting it as the creature threw itself against it. The door shook with each hit, but it held. After what felt like forever, the banging stopped, and the creature was gone. Inside, I looked down at my legs and saw that the skin had melted off in places. My legs were raw and bleeding. Toby, who had been so brave, started to cry. Mrs. Grieg cleaned my wounds, her hands steady and calm, like she had done this before. I tried not to look at the mess the tar had made of my legs, but it was hard to ignore the pain. Later that night, we learned that Mr. Grieg had gone out to look for us when we were late getting home. He hadn't come back. Life after that night wasn't the same. Toby and I didn't play outside anymore. Our parents were more cautious, always watching the sky, the clock, and each other. We only saw the Griegs occasionally. When I did see Toby, he was always close to his mom, looking like he was still shaken from what happened. Even though we lived in the same town, Toby and I grew apart. I think it was because we both felt guilty. Guilty for going to the clearing, guilty for what happened to his dad, and guilty for not being able to stop it. The carefree days of playing in the street were gone. My legs eventually healed, but the scars never fully went away. They turned from an angry red to a pale pink, always reminding me of that night and the black tar that almost took me. My mum bought me long pants to wear to school so no one could see the scars. But even with the scars hidden, the memories were still fresh. The town moved on, just like it always did. The plant kept running, the smoke still rising from its chimneys. People went to work, came home, and locked their doors at night. But in our house, there was a new tension. My parents argued more. They waited until they thought I was asleep, but I could hear them through the walls. My mum would bring up that night, shouting at my dad about what happened to Mr. Grieg and the burns on my legs. One night, things got especially bad. My mum was yelling, saying that living here wasn't worth it. I curled up in bed, holding my old teddy bear tight against my chest, even though I was much too old for it. The argument got louder, and I heard the front door slam. I crept down the stairs and found my dad standing in the hallway, staring at the open door. "She's gone," he whispered, not looking at me. My heart raced. My mum had gone outside. At night. The thing from the alley was out there and she was alone. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my coat and ran out the door. It was pitch black outside. The street lights flickered, casting weak beams of light that barely cut through the darkness. I was about to call for my mum when I heard another door slam. "Charlie!" It was Toby. He was standing on his porch, his face pale in the dim light. "Toby, my mum, she's gone," I said, trying to catch my breath. "She went outside, down there." Toby's face tightened with fear, but he didn't hesitate. "I'll come with you," he said, stepping off the porch. We walked side by side down a narrow alleyway. The same alley where we had encountered the creature years ago. The plant's groaning echoed in the distance, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. Every step felt like a countdown, like we were walking into something terrible. Then we heard it, a scream. It was my mum's voice, and it came from the next street over. My heart skipped a beat, and Toby grabbed my hand. We quickened our pace, but as we got closer, we heard another sound, the clicking noise, the same clicking we had heard that night when the creature came after us. The noise was getting louder, and I felt my stomach drop. The creature was back. Toby squeezed my hand. "It's okay," I lied again, but the fear in my voice gave me away. The clicking grew closer, and the alley felt like it was closing in on us. We were trapped, just like before. Then the black tar started to appear, seeping along the ground. It moved fast, bubbling and hissing as it spread toward us. The creature was close now. I could hear its screech, see its twisted body coming into view. The same horrible, nightmarish figure we had barely escaped from. I could see the tar beginning to burn the ground where it touched, just like it had burned my legs all those years ago. Panic surged through me. The creature's arms stretched out from the tar, long and thin, reaching toward us. Its face twisted in agony as it let out another screech, making the air around us feel heavy and thick with smoke. For a moment, as the tar shifted, I saw something underneath it, something almost human. A hand, raw and exposed, struggling beneath the tar. The creature's body twisted violently, and its back was visible for just a second. My eyes locked onto a scar, a large, rectangular scar on its shoulder. It looked familiar, too familiar. I gasped, my mind racing. The scar. It was the same scar Mr. Grieg had on his shoulder before he disappeared. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This thing, this creature, had once been Mr. Grieg. Toby saw it too. I could tell by the look on his face. He had known all this time, and now we were facing the same thing again. The creature's screech pulled me back to the moment. It was getting closer, and the tar was creeping toward our feet. We were running out of time. Toby looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "You'll be okay, Charlie," he said, his voice soft but steady. Then, before I could stop him, he let go of my hand and ran straight toward the creature. "Toby, no!" I screamed, but it was too late. He darted past the creature, drawing its attention away from me. The creature twisted around, its eyes locking onto Toby. It let out a horrible, gut-wrenching screech and lunged after him. Toby kept running, leading the creature away from the alley and into the dark streets. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, watching as Toby disappeared with the creature close behind him. The tar began to recede, pulled along with the creature as it chased Toby. The alley was empty now, the ground scorched and steaming where the tar had touched it. I wanted to run after Toby to help him, but my legs wouldn't move. I was too scared, too shocked. I knew what Toby had done. He had sacrificed himself to save me, just like Mr. Grieg had sacrificed himself that night years ago. I ran back home, my chest tight with fear and guilt. My mum was still out there, but I couldn't think straight. All I could think about was Toby. When I reached my house, I burst through the door, tears streaming down my face. My dad stood in the hallway looking lost and empty. I wanted to tell him what had happened, to scream that Toby was gone, but no words came out. The days that followed were a blur. My mum eventually returned, shaken but unharmed. But Toby didn't. He was gone, just like his dad. No one talked about it, and life in the town went on as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget. The memory of that night stayed with me, haunting my every thought. Years passed, and the scars on my legs faded, but the pain inside never did. I often found myself wondering what happened to Toby. Did he become like the creature too? Or did he somehow escape? I would never know for sure, but one thing was clear. The plant, the town, and the thing that had taken Mr. Grieg and Toby were all connected. And now, every time I hear the distant groaning of the plant, I remember that night. I remember the sacrifice Toby made to save me. And I will never forget the scar on the creature's shoulder, the one that looked so much like the one Mr. Grieg had. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.